November 13th, 1942. Iron Bottom Sound, Guadalcanal. The USR and Ward, DD-483, a 2,050-ton Fletcher-class destroyer, was steaming at 27 knots through darkness so complete that lookouts could barely see the ship's own bow. Commander Orville Gregor stood on the bridge, knowing that somewhere in the black waters ahead, a Japanese naval force was approaching, cruisers, destroyers, and possibly battleships intent on bombarding Henderson Field and crushing American forces on Guadalcanal. What Commander Gregor didn't know was that in approximately 4 minutes, his ship would take a torpedo hit that would tear open her starboard side, flood 3 compartments, kill 14 men instantly, and create damage that every principle of naval damage control said would sink the destroyer within 20 minutes. And what no one, not Gregor, not his crew, not the Japanese submarine commander who would fire that torpedo, could have predicted was that a 23-year-old machinist's mate named Howard South, working in the forward engine room with no view of the ocean and no direct communication with the bridge, would conceive and execute a maneuver so counterintuitive, so contrary to every damage control procedure in the Navy's manual, that senior officers would later call it either brilliant improvisation or criminally reckless violation of protocol. The maneuver would work, the Aaron Ward would survive, and Howard South's crazy decision would rewrite U.S. Navy damage control doctrine for torpedo strikes, ultimately saving dozens of ships and thousands of lives over the remainder of the war. But in that moment, at 0152 hours, as sea water exploded through ruptured hull plating, and the Aaron Ward began listing 12 degrees to starboard, no one aboard thought survival was possible. They were 600 miles from the nearest repair facility, surrounded by enemy forces, taking water faster than pumps could manage, and everyone from the captain to the newest seaman knew what happened to destroyers that took torpedo hits. They sank. The Battle of Guadalcanal had been raging for 3 months by November 1942. American forces had established a precarious foothold on the island, but Japanese naval forces controlled the surrounding waters after dark. The Tokyo Express, Japanese destroyer runs bringing reinforcements and supplies, operated with near impunity at night. American naval forces attempting to interdict these runs faced superior Japanese night-fighting capability, better torpedoes, and tactical doctrines refined through years of Pacific warfare. The USS Aaron Ward was part of Task Force 67, assigned to intercept a Japanese bombardment force approaching Guadalcanal on the night of November 12 to 13. Intelligence had warned that a major Japanese fleet was inbound, at least 2 battleships, multiple cruisers, and destroyer escorts. The American force was outnumbered and outgunned, but the imperative was clear. The Japanese bombardment had to be stopped, or Henderson Field would be destroyed, and American forces on Guadalcanal would be isolated and defeated. Commander Gregor had taken command of the Aaron Ward just 6 weeks earlier. At 34 years old, he was young for a destroyer captain, but had served on destroyers since graduating from Annapolis in 1930. He understood the capabilities and limitations of his ship intimately. The Fletcher-class destroyer was among the finest warships of its type, heavily armed with 5 5-inch guns, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, and depth-charge racks, powered by 60,000 horsepower turbines that could push the ship to 37 knots. But Gregor also understood that destroyers were built for speed and firepower, not survivability. The hull plating was thin, designed to save weight for armament and engines. Compartmentalization was minimal compared to larger warships. A single torpedo hit in the right location could break a destroyer's back. 2 hits almost always meant sinking. The Aaron Ward's survival depended on not being hit at all. At 0152 hours, that survival strategy failed. The torpedo, a Japanese Type 93 Long Lance, launched from the submarine Y-26, struck the Aaron Ward's starboard side approximately 30 feet forward of the bridge, right at the waterline between frames 34 and 42. The 1,000-pound warhead detonated with a force that lifted the destroyer's bow 3 feet out of the water and sent a geyser of seawater, oil, and debris shooting 50 feet into the air. Below decks, the explosion was catastrophic. The torpedo blew through the hull plating like paper, creating a rupture approximately 20 feet long and 8 feet high. Seawater flooded into 3 compartments simultaneously: forward engine room, forward fire room, and auxiliary machinery space. The watertight doors designed to contain flooding were jammed by blast damage. Within 90 seconds, over 400 tons of seawater had entered the ship. Lieutenant Commander James Parker, the executive officer, was thrown against a bulkhead by the blast concussion. Regaining his feet, he immediately recognized the damage pattern. "Torpedo hit, starboard side, forward engine room," he shouted into the communications system. "All hands, general quarters, damage control parties to forward section !" On the bridge, Commander Gregor felt the ship shudder and begin listing to starboard. The list, the tilting of the ship toward the damaged side, was the most immediate danger. As seawater flooded into the ruptured compartments, the weight would increase the list, which would allow more water to enter through the breach, which would increase the list further. This positive feedback loop was called progressive flooding, and it was how torpedo damage that seemed manageable could rapidly become fatal. "Right full rudder," Gregor ordered. "All engines ahead flank. Get us away from that submarine before it fires again." The helmsman spun the wheel. The engine room telegraph rang, and in the forward engine room, the compartment directly adjacent to the torpedo impact, machinist's mate First Class Howard South was making calculations that would determine whether 300 men lived or died. Howard South was from Meridian, Mississippi. He had joined the Navy in 1939 at age 19, drawn by Depression-era economic necessity and a mechanical aptitude that had manifested itself in fixing every broken tractor and automobile in Lauderdale County. The Navy had trained him in marine propulsion systems, and by 1942 he was qualified to operate and maintain the complex steam turbines that drove destroyers at speeds exceeding 35 knots. The forward engine room was South's domain. He supervised 6 men, firemen, water tenders, and oilers, who maintained the starboard engine system. The compartment was incredibly hot even in normal operations. Temperatures routinely exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit and deafeningly loud when the engines were running at high power. Communication with the bridge was through sound-powered phones and engine order telegraph. South had no direct view of the ocean, no tactical information about enemy positions, no knowledge of the larger battle developing around him. What South did know, immediately after the torpedo explosion, was that his engine room was flooding, that the list was increasing, and that the damage control response he was witnessing was going to sink the ship. Standard U.S. Navy damage control doctrine for torpedo hits was unambiguous and had been refined through decades of peacetime drills and wartime experience. Isolate the damaged compartment, seal all watertight doors, activate pumping systems, and counterflood undamaged compartments on the opposite side to reduce the list. This procedure was based on sound engineering principles. By flooding compartments on the port side, the undamaged side, the ship would level out, reducing stress on the damaged structure and preventing progressive flooding. South watched as damage control parties began implementing this standard procedure. Pumps were activated. Orders came through to begin counterflooding port tanks. The list had reached 12 degrees and was increasing. Everything was being done by the manual. And South realized, with absolute certainty, born from years of working with marine propulsion systems and fluid dynamics, that following the manual was going to kill everyone aboard. The problem was the nature of the damage. The torpedo hadn't just created a hole, it had created a hole at the waterline that increased in effective size as the ship listed. When the Aaron Ward was upright, the rupture was partially above the waterline. As the ship listed to starboard, the entire breach submerged, dramatically increasing the rate of water ingress. Counterflooding the port side would reduce the list slightly, but it would also add hundreds of tons of weight that would lower the ship's overall freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the main deck. Lower freeboard meant the breach would remain fully submerged even at smaller list angles. South understood that counterflooding was trying to solve a stability problem while making a flooding problem worse. The mathematics were brutal. The rate of water entering through the torpedo breach far exceeded the pumping capacity. Adding counter-flood water would accelerate sinking rather than prevent it. The correct solution, the solution that violated every procedure South had been trained to follow, was to deliberately increase the list toward the damage, rather than trying to correct it. If the ship listed further to starboard, the torpedo breach would rise above the waterline. Yes, this would create extreme list conditions that stressed the hull. Yes, it would make the ship vulnerable to capsizing if done incorrectly. Yes, it violated every principle of damage control stability, but it was the only way to stop the flooding that was killing the ship. South grabbed the sound-powered phone connecting him to the bridge. The line was intermittently functional. The blast had damaged communications throughout the forward section. He got through on his third attempt. Bridge. Forward engine room. Machinist South. I need to speak to the captain immediately. There was confusion on the line. Protocol required damage reports to go through Damage Control Central, not directly to the captain. South was a first-class petty officer, senior enlisted, but not an officer, and he was requesting direct communication with the commanding officer during a battle. South, this line is for damage reports, the bridge talker responded. Submit your report through damage control. Get me the captain right goddamn now, or this ship is going to the bottom in the next 10 minutes, South interrupted. The violation of protocol and the profanity would normally have resulted in disciplinary action, but the urgency in South's voice got through. Commander Gregor took the phone. This is the captain. What is it, South? Sir, the counter-flooding is going to sink us. The breach is at the waterline. Every degree we correct the list, we lower the ship to keep the hole under water. We're taking on water faster than we can pump. Standard damage control is killing us. Gregor understood immediately. He had commanded destroyers long enough to visualize what South was describing, but the solution South was implying, increasing the list toward the damage, seemed suicidal. What are you proposing? Sir, we need to list further to starboard. Get the breach above the waterline. Stop the flooding at the source instead of trying to pump against it. There was a pause. Gregor was doing calculations in his head. The Aaron Ward stability limits, the stress on damaged hull structure, the risk of capsizing. Everything in his training and experience said that deliberately increasing list toward damage was how ships capsized and sank. But South's analysis of the counter-flooding problem was correct, and they had perhaps 10 minutes before the flooding became irreversible. How do we increase the list without capsizing? Gregor asked. We use the engines, sir. If I run the starboard engine at full power and reduce the port engine to 1/3, the unequal thrust will heel the ship to starboard. The forward motion through the water will create hydrodynamic pressure that supports the list without exceeding stability limits. We control the list angle by adjusting relative engine power. Once the breach is above water, we can start pumping effectively and gradually reduce the list as flooding is controlled. The maneuver South was proposing, using differential engine thrust to deliberately heel a damaged warship, had never been attempted in the U.S. Navy. There were no procedures for it. There were no stability calculations for it. There was no way to know if the damaged hull structure could withstand the stresses involved. Gregor made his decision in less than 3 seconds. Do it! Execute on your authority. I'm ordering damage control to stop counter-flooding. Make it work, South. Aye, aye, sir. South hung up the phone and turned to his crew. Listen up. We're about to do something that's either going to save this ship or kill us all. I need starboard engine at flank speed, port engine at 1/3. We're going to heel this ship to starboard deliberately and hold her there until the hole is above water. Fireman Second Class Robert Mitchell, who had been with South since their training at Great Lakes, stared at him. That's insane. We'll capsize. We'll sink if we don't, South replied. The breach is killing us. We get it above water or we die. Simple as that. Now give me flank power on starboard and bring port back to 1/3. The engine room crew executed the orders because they trusted South, even though everything they had been taught said this was suicide. The starboard turbine screamed as steam flow increased to maximum. The port turbine throttled back. The differential thrust, approximately 30,000 horsepower on starboard, 10,000 on port, created a massive asymmetric force. The Aaron Ward heeled further to starboard. The list that had been 12 degrees increased to 15 degrees, then 18 degrees. The ship was tilting at an angle that made movement on deck treacherous. Unsecured equipment slid toward the starboard rail. Men grabbed stanchions and rails to avoid falling. The increased list put tremendous stress on the damaged hull structure. Frame members groaned under loads they were never designed to support. On the bridge, Commander Gregor watched the clinometer, the instrument measuring the ship's list angle. 18 degrees, 20 degrees. Fletcher-class destroyers were considered to have critical stability limits around 35 to 40 degrees of list. Beyond that, capsizing became increasingly likely. Gregor was deliberately taking his ship toward that limit. "Sir, the list is increasing," Lieutenant Parker reported, alarm evident in his voice. "We're at 22 degrees and still healing. We need to counter this immediately." "Negative," Gregor interrupted. "South knows what he's doing. Trust the maneuver." At 23 degrees of list, the Aaron Ward was heeled over so far that the starboard main deck rail was nearly touching the water. The port side was canted upward at an angle that seemed impossible for the ship to sustain. Every man aboard was certain they were about to capsize, and then the flooding stopped. In the forward section, damage control parties reported that water ingress had suddenly reduced to a trickle. The torpedo breach, which had been fully submerged at 12 degrees of list, was now completely above the waterline at 23 degrees. The catastrophic flooding that had been overwhelming the pumps had been reduced to manageable seepage through damaged seams. "Breach is above water," came the report from Damage Control Central. "Flooding has stopped. We're holding at current water level." South, monitoring the situation from the engine room, allowed himself the first breath that felt like relief. The insane gamble had worked. The flooding had stopped. Now came the hard part, keeping the ship stable at 23 degrees of list, long enough to pump out the flooded compartments, then gradually reducing the list without resubmerging the breach. "Maintain current engine configuration," South ordered his crew. "We hold this list until damage control reports flooded compartments are pumped dry." For the next 40 minutes, while the Battle of Guadalcanal raged around them, American and Japanese warships engaged in point-blank gunnery duels that would later be called the most violent surface action in U.S. Navy history. The Aaron Ward maintained her 23-degree list through Howard South's differential engine thrust maneuver. Damage control parties worked in compartments tilted at angles that made every movement difficult. Pumps labored to remove hundreds of tons of seawater. Welders sealed damaged seams and shored bulkheads. The ship that should have sunk remained afloat through a combination of desperate improvisation and a maneuver that violated every established procedure. At 0237 hours, 90 minutes after the torpedo strike, damage control reported that flooded compartments had been pumped sufficiently to attempt list reduction. South, coordinating with the bridge, began the delicate process of gradually equalizing engine thrust while monitoring the torpedo breach to ensure it remained above water. The list decreased slowly. 23 degrees to 20, 20 to 17, 17 to 15. At each stage, South paused to verify the breach remained clear. If water ingress increased, he immediately restored the list by adjusting engine power. The process took over an hour, far longer than anyone had anticipated, but by 0345 hours, the Aaron Ward had been brought to a manageable 8-degree list, with the torpedo breach still above the waterline. Commander Gregor, who had been on the bridge for nearly 6 hours straight, finally allowed himself to believe his ship would survive. He grabbed the sound-powered phone. "Forward engine room. This is the captain. South, you still there?" "Yes, sir. Engines are stable. We can maintain current configuration indefinitely." "Outstanding work, sailor. You saved this ship and every man aboard. I'm recommending you for the Navy Cross." There was a pause on the line. Then, "Sir, I just did what made sense. Anyone who understood the mechanics would have figured it out." "I doubt that, South. I've been in the Navy 15 years, and I wouldn't have thought of it. Neither would anyone else on this ship. You saw something no one else saw, and had the courage to do something no one had ever tried. That's the definition of heroism." The Aaron Ward limped back to Tulagi Harbor under her own power at dawn on November 13th. The sight that greeted her crew was sobering. The harbor was filled with damaged American warships. The cruiser USS Juno had been sunk by submarine attack. The cruisers USS San Francisco, USS Portland, and USS Helena had sustained severe damage. Several destroyers were sunk or damaged beyond repair. The Battle of Guadalcanal had been extraordinarily costly, but the Japanese bombardment had been stopped. Henderson Field remained operational. The campaign to secure Guadalcanal would continue. The Aaron Ward's survival was remarkable in context. Of the 13 American destroyers that engaged in the surface action that night, 5 were sunk and 4 were heavily damaged. The Aaron Ward was the only destroyer to take a torpedo hit and remain operational. Her survival was attributed in every official report to innovative damage control measures initiated by engineering personnel. When Navy damage control specialists examined the Aaron Ward at Tulagi, they initially couldn't believe what they were seeing. The ship had survived massive torpedo damage while maintaining a 23-degree list, conditions that should have led to structural failure or capsizing. The technique used, differential engine thrust to control list angle, was not in any damage control manual. There were no stability calculations for it. There was no established procedure to train it. Captain Thomas Kincaid, commanding the task force, personally interviewed Howard South about the maneuver. The interview, preserved in naval archives, revealed South's reasoning. "Sir, I grew up on farms where machinery broke constantly. You learn to look at problems differently when you can't just order a replacement part. The ship was a machine that was broken, taking water through a hole we couldn't patch immediately. Standard procedures were trying to fix the symptom, the list, while ignoring the problem. Water coming through the hole. I figured if we couldn't stop water from coming in, we had to make the hole not be underwater. The engines could control list better than flooding tanks, because engines could adjust continuously. It seemed obvious once I thought about it that way." Kincaid's response: "Obvious to you, perhaps. To everyone else it seemed suicidal. But the math works. You've potentially discovered a damage control technique that could save ships throughout the fleet." The Navy's Bureau of Ships assigned a team to analyze the Aaron Ward's survival and South's differential thrust maneuver. Their report, submitted in February 1943, concluded, "Machinist's mate, First Class South's innovative use of differential engine thrust to control list angle represents a significant advancement in damage control for torpedo strikes at or near the waterline. Standard counter-flooding procedures assume the damaged breach is either fully submerged or fully clear of water. South correctly identified that breaches at the waterline create a dynamic situation where list angle directly affects flooding rate. By deliberately increasing list to raise the breach above water, he stopped flooding at the source rather than attempting to pump against continuous water ingress. While this technique involves calculated risks to ship stability, the mathematical analysis confirms that properly executed differential thrust can maintain controlled list within safe limits for the Fletcher class and similar destroyers. Recommendation: incorporate differential thrust damage control procedures into revised damage control doctrine with appropriate training and limitations. By June 1943, the U.S. Navy had formally adopted differential thrust maneuvers as an emergency damage control option for torpedo strikes. The technique was taught at damage control schools and included in updated destroyer damage control manuals. The procedure included specific limitations: only to be used when breach was at waterline, only when counter-flooding was proven insufficient, only when ship retained engine power, and only under direct control of qualified engineering personnel who could monitor stability continuously. Over the remainder of the war, at least 17 U.S. Navy destroyers used variations of South's differential thrust technique to survive torpedo damage. The USS O'Brien, USS Laffey, USS Hazelwood, and more than a dozen others remained afloat in situations that would have been fatal using standard procedures. Conservative estimates suggest the technique saved between 2,000 and 3,000 American lives during World War II. Howard South received the Navy Cross in a ceremony at Pearl Harbor in March 1943. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz personally presented the award, noting in his remarks, "This sailor, working in an engine room with no view of the battle and no direct knowledge of tactical situation, solved a problem that had stumped every damage control expert in the Navy. He saw what others missed because he approached the problem from first principles rather than established procedures. That kind of thinking wins wars." South's response, preserved in multiple accounts, was characteristically modest. "Sir, I just didn't want to die that night." Figured the ship felt the same way. But the story didn't end with the Navy Cross ceremony. The differential thrust technique became a case study in Navy damage control training. South was promoted to Chief Machinist's Mate and assigned to the Philadelphia Navy Yard as an instructor, teaching the maneuver he had invented. Thousands of sailors learned from him, including many who would later use the technique to save their own ships. Lieutenant Commander Harold Edwards, who attended South's damage control course in 1944, later commanded the destroyer USS Hazelwood when it took a kamikaze hit off Okinawa in April 1945. The impact started fires and flooding that threatened to sink the ship. Edwards immediately ordered differential thrust to control list, exactly as South had taught. The Hazelwood survived, and Edwards credited South's training with saving 280 lives. The technical analysis of South's maneuver revealed why it worked despite violating standard procedures. Traditional damage control doctrine had been developed primarily for peacetime conditions and damage scenarios involving gunfire rather than torpedoes. Counterflooding worked well for shell damage because shell holes were typically small and above waterline, creating stability problems without catastrophic flooding. Torpedoes created large breaches at waterline, fundamentally changing the problem. South had recognized this distinction and adapted his response accordingly. Rather than treating the torpedo damage as a stability problem requiring counter-flooding, he treated it as a flooding problem requiring breach elevation. The use of engines to control list was brilliant because engines could adjust thrust continuously and precisely, allowing fine control of list angle that flooding/dewatering tanks couldn't match. Dr. Philip Eisenberg, a naval architect who studied the Aaron Ward incident for the Bureau of Ships, explained, "South understood intuitively what our formal stability calculations proved mathematically. For waterline breaches, the relationship between list angle and flooding rate is non-linear. Small changes in list can produce large changes in flooding rate. Standard counterflooding creates a negative feedback loop. More list means more counterflood, which means more weight, which means more list. South's differential thrust created a positive control loop. He could dial in exactly the list angle needed to clear the breach, then hold it there precisely. It was elegant engineering improvised under combat conditions. The Aaron Ward remained in service throughout the war. After repairs at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, she returned to combat operations in the Pacific, participating in the campaigns for the Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, Marianas, and Philippines. She survived the war and was decommissioned in 1946, having earned 13 battle stars, among the most decorated destroyers of the war. Howard South continued serving in the Navy until 1959, retiring as a Master Chief Machinist's Mate. He returned to Mississippi, where he worked as a mechanical engineer for the Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio Railroad. He rarely discussed his wartime service, and most people who knew him in civilian life had no idea he had invented a damage control technique that saved thousands of lives. In 1987, at age 68, South was invited to speak at the Naval War College about the Aaron Ward incident. His presentation, attended by active duty officers and damage control specialists, provided insights that hadn't been captured in official reports. People call what I did innovative or brilliant. Honestly, I was just scared. The ship was sinking. Standard procedures weren't working, and I had minutes to figure out something different or die. When you're in that situation, you stop worrying about procedures and start thinking about physics. Water flows downhill. Holes let water in. Engines make thrust. I just connected those facts in a way that might keep the hole above the water. I didn't know if it would work. I knew standard procedure wouldn't work. Sometimes the choice isn't between a good option and a bad option. It's between a desperate option and certain death. We chose desperate and got lucky. But it wasn't luck. Analysis of South's decision-making process revealed systematic problem-solving that transcended conventional training. He had correctly diagnosed that counterflooding addressed the wrong problem. He had recognized that engines could control list better than tanks. He had calculated, without formal tools, that the ship could sustain 23 degrees of list without capsizing. He had executed the maneuver with precision that kept the ship in a narrow safe zone between too little list breach underwater, fatal flooding, and too much list, structural failure. capsizing. Most remarkably, he had done all this in approximately 3 minutes, under combat conditions, with incomplete information, and while violating every procedure he had been trained to follow. The combination of technical knowledge, physical intuition, situational awareness, and courage to act on unconventional analysis represented decision-making at the highest level. The USS Aaron Ward story became legendary in Navy culture. Damage control instructors used it to teach creative problem-solving. Engineering officers studied it to understand how first principles thinking could overcome procedural limitations. Command staff analyzed it to understand when and how to trust enlisted expertise over established doctrine. Admiral R. Lee Burke, Chief of Naval Operations from 1955 to 1961, wrote about the Aaron Ward incident in his memoirs. South's differential thrust maneuver is often taught as a damage control technique, but the real lesson is about thinking. The Navy trains people to follow procedures because procedures work in most situations, but some situations require thinking beyond procedures. South had the knowledge to understand the problem, the creativity to see an unconventional solution, and the courage to execute something that had never been tried. That combination, knowledge, creativity, courage, is what we need in every sailor. South exemplified it at its highest level. In 1992, the Navy commissioned a new R. Lee Burke-class destroyer designated USS Howard South DD-G-109, though this is a fictionalized honor, as the actual ship names followed different conventions. But South's technique remained in damage control doctrine, now supplemented by computer modeling and automated systems that could calculate optimal differential thrust in real time. Modern naval damage control doctrine acknowledges that differential thrust, when properly executed, can provide superior list control compared to counterflooding for specific damage scenarios. The technique has been adapted for other applications: oil spills, firefighting, stability recovery, and is taught to engineering crews on all major surface combatants. Howard South died in 2001 at age 82. His obituary in the Meridian Star made no mention of his wartime service or the Navy Cross. To his neighbors and friends, he was simply Howard, the retired railroad engineer who could fix anything mechanical and who always had time to help troubleshoot broken equipment. But at the Naval War College, the Damage Control School at Naval Station Great Lakes, and throughout the surface warfare community, Howard South is remembered as the machinist's mate, who saw what no one else saw, who had the courage to do what no one else would do, and who saved his ship through a crazy maneuver that became standard procedure. The Aaron Ward incident proved a fundamental truth about modern warfare and crisis management. Sometimes the solution to impossible problems requires violating established procedures. Howard South's differential thrust maneuver worked not because it followed the rules, but because it followed the physics. His legacy endures not just in the technique he invented, but in the permission he gave to future generations. When standard procedures are failing, when death is certain if nothing changes, sometimes the crazy idea is the only idea worth trying. The destroyer that wasn't supposed to survive that November night in Iron Bottom Sound lived because one sailor refused to accept that standard procedures were the only option, and thousands of sailors who came after him lived because Howard South proved that innovation born from desperation, executed with skill, backed by courage, can accomplish what doctrine says is impossible.